get it. So we'll deal with that. So I think a good way to end is probably one that kind of extends the conversation that we had, and I hope you brought your questions. The cattle business, the beef business is extremely important in Kansas. You know, a lot of times we focus on the aviation industry, but production agriculture, and as we talked about yesterday, where we are in top 10 as far as different commodities and red meat production, and beef is right there. So one of the, I guess since he's younger than me, I would call one of the bright young ag economists in the country is at K-State. And where he's, you know, he does a tremendous job every year, and he has put up with me over the years, throwing a mic in his face, and he always knows I ask really dumb questions, so he always tries to save me. But that's really not the reason why. You know, there's so many questions. What's going on in the market right now? Where maybe this week we may end up, you know, having a little bump in cash cattle prices. We've been stuck where we have been for 7 weeks, or he'll probably tell us the reason why. Where we are with the Board of Trade, where we are with boxed beef prices, the where, whys, and hows, and really where we've been the last year. And he's going to bring probably some perspective from a land grant, you know, non-biased place is where I think it's where we want to get information. But he is well defined on a number of different topics of the industry, so he'll be open for questions as well after presentation. So with that, we welcome Dr. Glenn Tonser, ag economist from K-State, to Ag Committee. Dr. Tonser, thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Mr. Chairman. There we go. Hopefully this is working. Let's just do a check. Does everything look good, sound good to those of you that are checking it? While you do that, I have to respond. Thanks for the nice introduction. The cameras are picking up my bald head from lots of angles, so I'm not real young. Yeah. Yeah, all right, looks like we're good. So it is a pleasure to be here. I'm going to extend that introduction a bit because I know some of you in the room, but not everybody. So I'm going to make this brief, but I think it's important to know who I am and where I come from. So I just picked on my bald head, but to make that point a little deeper, one of the pictures up here is actually from the farm I grew up on. So I grew up on a hog farm in Missouri, and that's important to know where I start. My affinity with meat production and livestock production starts there. I usually joke saying my fingernails are a little cleaner today than they were 25 years ago. But a lot of how I think through the issues in the industry honestly starts from that upbringing. And then I've been overeducated since then. So we're getting a lot of these pop-ups. I hope they're not as annoying to you guys as they are me. I will just ignore them if they come up again, but I'll close them, see if it helps once. There you go. So I've included here just briefly my educational background, and you can tell me if I need to stop. Chair, that's fine. But I grew up on the farm, got my BS from Missouri State studying ag and then economics as a minor, came to K-State, got my PhD in ag econ. First post after that was Michigan State. I married my bride, who is also a K-Stater, and we came back in 2010. We've been here since 2010, more or less in my current post as a professor at K-State. I want to add to that the background on what I do. So it's kind of who I am. Now, what do I do? I conduct a lot of research and extension. The vast majority of that is in the meat and livestock space, and even more narrowly, it's in the beef or the pork space. Some of it involves poultry. You can't answer meat demand questions well without understanding poultry. But I've listed here a host of the agencies and groups that are either directly funding or collaborating on that portfolio of projects, either now or in recent months. And I want you to take note that there's a list of multiple USD agencies that have different roles in, you know, how we track things, where we get information from, so forth. Both checkoff groups, pork checkoff and beef checkoff, are listed here. Producer associations, so both NCBA as well as U.S. Cattlemen's Association and so forth. I could give you a longer list than this, but I'm trying to give you a flavor that my comments today are coming from a perspective of lots of projects that are in a broader portfolio of research and extension that tackle lots of different topics. All right, with that, I want to set the stage on prices as the chair kind of teed it up in the introduction. I pull a lot of information from a group called LMIC. So that is short for Livestock Marketing Information Center. Sidebar, there's another LMIC at K-State. Don't get those two confused. This is a national, actually North American group. It's based in Denver. And to paraphrase what this LMIC does is they pull together a lot of data from primarily USDA, but a lot of other groups as well, process it, clean it, kick out PowerPoint slides and things like that that make it easy for me to use them and give talks. But they also have a host of price forecasting exercises. And I often make use of their forecast, and I'm bringing two of them to you today. So their latest forecast, dated as of March 11th, was for cow-calf prices in 2021, sales prices of Southern Plains calves, to be in the mid-160s, okay? Keep that in mind in a minute. Fed cattle prices for the year, 114 to 118 for the 5-market average, okay? And as the chair said, we've been at 114 in recent weeks. That's the annual average range that they're currently forecasting. Now, that's a sales price for the cow-calf sector and for the feedlot sector. All right, if I had a classroom in front of me entirely with a lot of time, I would really drive this home with a chalkboard. I won't use a chalkboard, but I didn't tell you anything about profit when I said something about sales price. You got to understand cost to understand anything about margins and profit. So point number one, right? That's the point of this slide. This slide is historic data from USDA, again compiled by LMIC, that goes back to the early 90s on their estimates of the cost to run a cow-calf operation. And surprise, surprise, the cost have went up over time. Why am I reminding you of that? Just telling you the calf price that you're expected to get when you sell, you need to compare that with some kind of cost information. Obviously, your own operation is best to understand margins. That's the sole point I want to make here. Costs have went up over time as labor, feedstuffs, land, lots of things have inflated over time. Just the cost of running any business has went up. Cow-calf sector is no different. So this brings me to this. What about returns? One of the things I was asked to talk about is correlations and relationships in the industry. And one of them I want to highlight from this slide is the relationship between how many animals we have in the system and returns. And this is for the cow-calf sector. I'm working my way briefly through the entire industry. So the cow-calf sector, we have margins, returns over cash cost, more narrowly, from LMIC going back to the early 90s. The bars that are upward are good years, positive. The ones that are down are red and negative. 2014 stands out like a sore thumb because that was a really good year for lots of reasons in the cattle industry. The blue line is the January 1st cattle inventory number. Every year, USDA puts out a total number of cattle in the system. In a big report, they break it down by state and the like. This is the aggregate number. What I want you to take note of just visually here, and hopefully you can see it visually, is when the inventories are higher, we tend to have weaker cow-calf returns. When the inventories are lower, we tend to have higher cow-calf returns. Now, just to put one simple statistic behind that is a real simple correlation, and we're not going to make it any more complicated than that today. The correlation between those two trends is pretty strong and negative, just like your eye would see. And if you use the full period of 1992 through 2021, it's a negative 0.6 correlation. So again, as inventories are growing, cow-calf returns tend to go down, and when inventories decline, cow-calf returns tend to go up, okay? What about feedlots? Something I maintain on our Ag Manager website, and if you haven't been to that website, I encourage you to go there. Not because my stuff is glorious. There's a whole bunch of folks at K-State that post information regularly there. It's kind of our extension interface. A lot of our fact sheets and ongoing barometers of what's going on in the ag economy you will find on agmanager.info. This is an example of one of the things that's regularly updated every month. It's a barometer of feedlot returns. And please note, I treat it as a barometer. It's important to understand exactly what it is. I take information from the Animal Science and Industry Department, specifically their focus on feedlot survey of feedlot industry participants in the state. And that gives me some insights about placement weight, sales weight, death loss, generalize that to the production aspects of the feedlot industry. And I marry that up with Kansas prices, specifically corn price to build in a cost of gain assessment, feeder cattle price for what you're paying for animals coming into the yard, and fed cattle prices, live negotiated specifically, coming out of the yard. In this exercise, I'm presuming no risk management. So I'm presuming you pay cash for corn as you need it, you paid cash for feeder cattle as you need them coming in, and you took cash for fed cattle as they went out. This would change if we started implementing hedging rules, and that's important because this is a risk management free barometer. The numbers up here, and there's a lot of them, you can read them later, but the punchline is, per that exercise, February was a month where the average operation that was selling steers in February that weren't protected from market changes lost money, specifically $80 per head is the number that's up there. but I was putting out projected margins that are positive for steers coming out March through September. If you read that whole table, that very first column's positive. And there's a lot of variability through that time because projected sales prices, as well as projected placement prices, as well as cost of gain, varies month to month to month. Okay? That's my best attempt, Chair, to give you a very quick, broad overview of what the setting is. And now I'm going to tackle 3 different issues that I think are top of mind, keeping in back in the mind the kind of supply and demand fundamentals I started with here. One is the packing sector. So more narrowly, the interface when we convert live animals into edible meat products. That is the role of the processing, packaging industry. That exists for all 3 major proteins. We're going to talk about beef and cattle almost exclusively today, unless our questions go elsewhere, but that's where I've put my focus. This slide right here is one I've borrowed from other talks, and it includes links to 4 different things just to document or give you a flavor of the dynamic, the very political, and the ever-evolving nature of the topics in that space. One of these is actually a link to an article that is not by Economist. It's diving into the actual COVID in this sector experience. How many cases were there by workers in this industry and so forth? Lots of discussion, particularly early in the pandemic in that space. Sets the tone for part of the bottleneck. I trust you guys probably know what I mean by the bottleneck. We struggled to convert live animals into meat for a couple months early in the pandemic. That brought on questions about how resilient is our industry. And here the term resiliency usually refers to, are we robust enough we can get a steady flow of meat products to consumers, to paraphrase what's in the mind of folks when they say resilient usually. So there's a lot of deep discussions around whether this industry is resilient, whether an alternative structure with more plants, different locations, different sizes, all those things are being asked, and there's lots of questions in that space. I've been trying to contribute from a data-driven research base on those topics. And then the last one that's up here, those are all links to what I just talked about if you want to dig into those more, is there is a ongoing economic base of knowledge on these topics. One of these is a paper I was part of that's trying to understand we call them marketing margins or price spreads, so the relationship between wholesale meat and live animals. And here specifically, we're going to talk boxed beef and fed cattle price. Same thing applies also on hogs, which is in that paper as well. So this is ever evolving. The next couple slides I'm going to show you have ongoing evolution on the top, not by accident, because things are always moving in the relationship in the industry or always adapting to the situation. This specific chart is one I've borrowed from Cattle Facts with permission. And what this chart is, it's the relationship between the number of fed animals we have in the system, so think steers and heifers that need to be slaughtered, this is an annual chart, in relation to the industry's capacity to actually harvest the animals. And it's annual, so there's annual bars here. And basically Cattle Facts has tried to approximate that relationship from a typical Monday to Friday operating perspective, okay? Bars that are above the 100%, which please note is where we're at now and been for a few years, represent points in time when we quote unquote have too many cattle relative to capacity, okay? So over 100% here basically means we got more cattle trying to get into today's capacity than we have capacity for, hence over 100. That's also why we run on Saturdays, because note this is a Monday through Friday barometer. Saturdays is the shock absorber in the industry. We run on weekends to try to keep current on cattle. We've been running Saturdays hard for a while now. Conversely, if you're below 100%, which was the case, say, in the middle of the last decade, for those of you that can read this chart with me, that's a period we actually had too much capacity relative to cattle. So when I say this is evolving, notice those bars aren't stagnant. They're not all one number over time, right? They're changing over time, and they're changing for lots of reasons. One is the actual capacity to harvest cattle evolves. So I'm going to take you back in time with one example. I've added text box and arrows here, so no longer attribute that to Cattle Facts. This would be errors of mine, if you like, to be clear. In 2013, Cargill closed a plant in Plainview, Texas. At the time, that was harvesting about 4,500 head. You'd have to ask Cargill specifically why they did that, but my personal opinion is it reflected part of the intuition on this chart is at that point in time, the industry had excess capacity relative to the number of steers and heifers in our industry, okay? Look, it corresponds with those bars being below 100. Fast forward to where we are now, 2020 was the high water mark, 112% is the number that Cattle Facts has up there. That's consistent with us using Saturdays hard for several months in a row to try to process the cattle that we have in front of us. Going forward, Red bars are projections by Cattle Facts. They're projecting us getting back towards something of an equilibrium, so to speak, closer to 100%, closer of a match between cattle supplies and capacity to harvest them. But that's driven by two separate evolutions also. One is the cattle supply is likely to come down. So at the top right, I've put in federal inspected slaughters expected to decline. We're just going to have less cattle in a couple of years than we have today. So less going through the system is the current expectation. Meanwhile, there's a lot of announcements, some of which may or may not come to fruition, we'll see in the future, but announcements about new plants or adding a second shift to existing plants and the like. Geographically, the closest one to here would be the recent announcement. The new group, North Platte, Nebraska, has announced maybe in 2023 there'll be a new plant up that harvests 1,500 head. That's an announcement, time will tell and so forth. There's actually a long list of those. But for today's purposes, please note added capacity while also removing cattle compared to the past. Both will push this relationship back towards 100%. So ever evolving is the point. So what about prices, okay? Again, the chair asked me to speak to correlations. I'm going to set this one up. This chart is 2005 to 2020, and it has two price series on it. The blue line is the 5-state annual average. So there's 5 major feeding cattle regions. I trust you guys know that. We can clarify that in Q&A if not. So I use that as a barometer here. Kansas is very similar to that as a general statement. And then the orange line at the top is the comprehensive boxed beef cutout. And I'm bringing the comprehensive to you because it's the most representative of all beef. You could also do choice, select, and other things separately, but the comprehensive is probably the best one for today's discussion. In the text box I added, is if you want not just the historic numbers, but where we're at right now, the week ending March 19th, which would be last week for those that watch a future recording of this, the comprehensive cutout was $229 per hundredweight, and the 5-area live steer price was $114 per hundredweight, as the chair noted in the introductory comments. But what about the relationship? So that's just prices over time. So now I'm going to hone in on the relationships because I think that was at least one of the targeted asks for me. So I took the prices that were on the last slide and simply put them as a percentage of each other. Narrowly, the blue line you now see is that live steer price as a percentage of the comprehensive cutout going back to 2005. And you can see it's evolved over time. Some years it went up, some years it went down, so on and so forth. At the same time, on this chart, I'm reminding you those Cattle Facts capacity utilization numbers. So this orange line here is the same data I showed you with vertical bars from Cattle Facts. Numerically, they're the same number. And you can see at the far end, we're over 100% where we are today, right? Remember that 2020, 112% number, that's what's up here. The punchline from this chart is, again, we have a negative correlation as expected. Relative prices tend to decline when we have a lot of cattle trying to get into current capacity. Hence a strong negative correlation between those two series. And that's not surprising. That's what economists would expect. The journal article I cited a couple slides ago, that's what we found. Past evidence of that exists. In general, if you've got a system that's flush with cattle, struggling to process them all, the derived demand for those cattle isn't as high. They don't need them from an economic perspective as much. They're full. So you would expect a negative correlation. Also, really important sitting here today during a pandemic, sidebar, I hope we're towards the end of the pandemic, but nonetheless, we're still in it and the industry's dealing with it. That comment about correlation says nothing about cost changes over time. And make no mistake that since March and the pandemic starting, cost of lots of things and lots of supply chains have adapted. We've altered throughput, whether it's overtime and so forth. That in no way is meant as an excuse for any sector, but I think it's really important to just be clear. The correlation I'm showing you right here is a historic one that doesn't make any adjustment for changes in cost. If the costs are going up, you'd expect there to be even bigger gap between boxed beef, what you're selling out the back door, and cattle coming in. And we've been seeing that as well. So you'd expect this general relationship to also be widened if your costs are also going up. It's not a surprise to me. Okay. For long-term context on this, that same information, this is the same slide, just with a couple more talking points added to it. The simple average from 05 to 2020 of that relative price ratio, so cattle relative to boxed beef, is 60.5%. If you want rules of thumb to compare that against, and rules of thumb are always dangerous, but I find them useful to start a discussion around, is what's actual just yield. So I'm not a meat scientist, remember I'm an economist, but yield is actually a part of profitability of running a slaughter and processing facility. So hot carcass yield is about 63%, as a good, reasonable rule of thumb over time. And then you have some amount of loss as you go from hot to cold carcass. So maybe 61% total sellable yield gets more reasonable. So if you're wanting to compare things, that's what you need to be comparing because it's two different commodities, right? Boxed beef versus live animal, they're different items. And at some point, you got to do those kind of things to make comparisons. Second thing I want to touch on is the role of trade. This is embedded in a lot of the questions I get. This is a fact sheet that I wrote, and I put a red box around it. I actually wrote it back in May. Lots of questions were coming at me in April and May about why do we import, why do we export, what do we import, what do we export, so on and so forth. This fact sheet just takes USDA annual data, specifically from 03 through 2019, and it documents the trends over that period. So 3 or 4 page fact sheet, you're welcome to read. I'm including links to all these things. You can read in more detail later. I've included here for your convenience, those two, the first and last year, if you want to know exactly how many pounds were in each market channel. So for example, 2.5 billion pounds of exports in 2003 versus a little bit over 3 billion pounds exported in 2019, just over 3 billion pounds imported in both years. To the far right, for those of you looking at the slides, I've simply done the percentage change, 2019 versus 2003. You can see we're exporting 20% more than we did in 2003, using the 2019 values, importing just under 2% more, so on and so forth. The other part to take from this that's really important if you want to understand the dynamics in the industry is the U.S. population is also changing. So if you look in the middle of this, I've included the U.S. population, and we have 13% more residents in the U.S. in 2019 versus 2003. So if you want to properly understand things like per capita beef consumption, how much a given person is consuming, you got to account for the fact the population is growing also. That shows up on here. At the very end, if you want rules of thumb, we historically have been exporting about 11% of what we produce, and we've been importing about 11% of what we consume. Those are very different items. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want, but if you want just numbers of volumes, I hope you find this helpful. I've built these two pie charts. So that was through 2019 because I did it in May of 2020. In preparation of today, I went back, I pulled together the 2020 data to give you a visual. So in 2020, we exported just under 3 billion pounds. That was down a little bit from the 2019 value, largely because of economic shocks around COVID and logistical challenges in producing meat. Where are the major customers? Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and Canada are the 4 largest customers, U.S. beef, with China growing. If you sum together mainland China and Taiwan, it's on par with Canada for 2020, and a lot of the hope and promise going forward would be in China as well. Beef and veal imports, to round this out, same type of approach. What is the sourcing countries of imports of beef and veal into the U.S.? First, how much? 3.3 billion pounds imported. That was up some compared to 2019, if you compare it to the previous 2 slides ago. Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, and Australia are the 4 largest, and that's not a new statement either, sources for our U.S. beef imports. Last thing, Mr. Chair, I'm going to give you, and this is mainly for future points and understanding the evolution in the industry, is there's a lot of shifts that happened that weren't just the bottleneck. So I'm purposely teeing up the bottleneck in the relationship between fed cattle and boxed beef prices. That's why I was asked to be here. But that's not the only shock that COVID brought in. We also had the consumer shock of retail purchasing going up, food service going down. And I monitor that regularly, and I'm going to give you 2 specific findings of that. The industry's profitability for the rest of 2021 and going forward, in no small part, will have a lot to do with recovery on food service demand. This is why I bring that to you. So at K-State, again, on our Ag Manager website, we maintain a host of meat demand information, past studies, ongoing demand indices, and the like. And I was going to share 2 slides on this, and I'm done. The monthly meat demand monitor is a new project that is jointly supported by the Beef and Pork Checkoff. Partners include the National Pork Board as well as U.S. Cattlemen's Association. K-State's a subcontractor in that story. And it's an ongoing survey effort to monitor perceptions and consumption and demand, and we can separate consumption and demand in Q&A if you want, on beef and pork in particular. I tee that up because things I was able to use that for, and I expect you will find value for the rest of 2021 on, is monitoring beef products separately in retail versus food service. This project started in February of 2020. You'll see on this chart right here, this is willingness to pay. It's a demand measure for ribeye steak. The top line, the blue line, is retail. So think grocery store, think purchasing of products to take home and consume. You will see that in April, ribeye steak retail demand was up. And again, fast forward, we get out to October, retail steak demand was up. Conversely, food service, so think restaurants, those same months it was down. Why am I highlighting April and then October? First round of stay-at-home orders, that pushed people staying at home, and then the fall, extra wave, some restrictions around the country and so forth. Ground beef has the same story, but the magnitude's even stronger. So this is ground beef built the same way as that ribeye interpretation. Both in April and October, retail demand for ground beef went up, food service demand for ground beef went down. To be very clear, this is important to understand one of the major shocks the industry is working through, and I'm hopeful, but we're going to use this to monitor, that recovery of food service demand will help raise the tide for all in the industry as 2021 persists. My summary comments, nearly all of us, and certainly this bald economist per the introduction joke I introduced earlier, underestimated the pandemic impacts. They've impacted every supply chain I know anything about. I know a lot more about the meat and livestock industry, but it's had a lot of effects. I'm amazed how quickly the industry adapted, pivoted, and made the best out of a crappy situation in many ways. I'll keep it at that, keep it PC, but there's a lot of challenges, okay? The entire industry, even before the pandemic, and certainly during the pandemic, has been evolving in lots of ways. It's not by accident I told you I grew up on a hog farm. I'm well aware of the changes in the broader meat and livestock industry, and on balance, I think a lot of those changes are good. The U.S. industry is really good at producing protein the world wants, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. Evolution of industries is actually healthy. There's always room for discussion and questions, and we're going to have some of that in a moment, I'm sure. That's fine. But the evolution is necessary, and in many ways, I think it's healthy. I'll end. I'm well aware there's a lot of calls for change. There's a lot of proposed policies out there. I'm not going to take a personal stand on any one of them. That's not my job. My job is hopefully to provide data and insight to inform the discussion rather than say yay or nay on any of those specifically. But my hope, and this is the reason I put on the slide, I genuinely hope that those policies and calls for change are assessed from a data-driven economic research logic perspective and less from an emotional one. That's easy for me to say, but I genuinely believe that. And if you want to hear me say it on recording in other ways, I said it in USDA Ag Outlook Forum and other spots. There's links to lots of my past webinars and so forth on agmanager.info. So, Mr. Chair, I will pass it back to you. You'll find a copy of these slides most likely in the morning. At some point tomorrow, we'll get them in PDF format posted. They'll be fully publicly available. Okay. Thank you.
Very good. Do we have them, Terry, too? Okay. And we'll also, committee, you'll get them as well, but you can go to Ag Manager. So, okay. You've heard that presentation. You know he's been coming now for a week. Do you have questions? Oh, come on. Y'all got good. Representative Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also studied economics and know very little bit about agriculture, so this was very interesting. Thank you very much. My question is just, what effect does that retail versus food service shock have on producers? The producer side, I don't understand.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the net effect was very different as we work towards producers, and I'm going to get halfway there to answer your question definitively. So I didn't talk about the parts of the cutout separately today. I brought in a cutout, which is a wholesale meat price series, but in reality we have primals, so parts of the animal there's prices for. And I'll give you an example is early in the pandemic, there was weeks when loin, which is a part of the animal that we get a lot of steak products from, was actually worth less than round, which is largely for ground beef production. Normally we don't see that because normally steak products bring a higher per pound value, but early in the pandemic, things were shocked so hard, the wholesale value of loin fell a lot, is the point. Why am I telling you that? If you are a producer, because producers in general sense, you've got seed stock producer, cow calf, all the way to feedlot, and then you've got producers that make ground beef products or producers that make loin, steak products, whatever. If you're somebody that was selling steak products, it hit you hard. If you're somebody that sells ground beef products, it was probably a net gain, right? If you culminate that together, if you were somebody that was just selling beef and didn't have it locked in, but beef became more valuable, you probably benefited. Agreed? If you're somebody exposed to the market early in the pandemic and there's lots of uncertainty on how many cattle we're going to be able to harvest tomorrow, cattle prices took a big hit, which is certainly what happened the first few weeks. So it was a net negative. So it was less of the food service versus retail in the early days. I would argue it was more uncertainty about demand as a whole and whether people are going to be comfortable spending money. Now, in hindsight, I could break it apart kind of like I was trying to do here, but as we were going through April and May, I was actually somebody saying demand's going to fall from this because we're entering a recession, all those kind of things. I personally very much underestimated the federal aid that would come to consumers as well as producers. And make no mistake, that has had an effect on mitigating some of these things. So that shows up helping meet demand, right? Because it boosted consumer incomes to keep spending money on food. So I hope that helps. But we can dissect it much better at the wholesale level because there are prices that are product level.
All right, other questions? Representative Newland?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much as a producer. My question is, back when the Holcomb fire took place and processing had to be moved to another plant, producers took a large hit at that point in time when they had their product contracted because they had to move to a different plant. I'm not sure that was quite, I didn't quite understand how that was stated in effect, how that worked.
So my understanding of that event, and to remind everybody, that's August 2019. It can get mixed up in the pandemic, but it's not. It's just another shock the industry was on the heels of when the pandemic hit, right? Is we had the Holcomb plant that had a fire and became offline and nationally represented between 5 and 6% of our ability to process cattle. Depends whose numbers you use, which number it is, but it was important, but it wasn't the magnitude that we had during the pandemic bottleneck. But nonetheless, all the cattle that were going to go to that Holcomb plant had to find a new home, right? Because that was the reality of that. So they were redirected to other plants, right? Sometimes same company, others not, and so forth. How that impacted producers would vary a lot, again, depending on who you are. So if you were somebody that had a specific relationship with that plant and so forth, and now you got to juggle, maybe you were on the list to find a new home for them. That was quite possible. If you were somebody that was spelling spot market, hoping that plant was going to buy your cattle, that was an extra challenge because that plant wasn't there to harvest your cattle for several months, right? I'm giving you the answer the way I am on purpose because the impact varied a lot across producers. Just economic logic would say your relationship and your other alternatives to sell cattle would have an impact on that, on your outcome. At the same time, it's not just Kansas producers that are impacted by that, right? So if you run a feed yard in Texas or Nebraska, and now there's more Kansas cattle coming to those plants that we weren't expecting, that impacts those markets also. So ever evolving was used for a reason in my slides, right? All these things are interconnected. It was not helpful for somebody selling fed cattle. I'm well aware of that. But how much did it hurt them would vary a lot depending upon that situation and their business relationship.
And then my second question was, if we were harvesting 112, 117% of capacity, then what are they doing with the processed product? It's hard to move that kind of percentage
so to be
out.
clear, you're referring to the Cattle Facts series I shared. That was their estimate of Monday through Friday. So if it's 112%, we're using Saturdays to actually accomplish the 12%. So the first point of clarity is that's how you physically do it. You're jumping to what we do with beef and other products, which is relevant. But we have to use Saturday to stay current when you have more than 100% coming in. That was the point. And if you have to run weekends, that creates other challenges, labor coordination and the like, right? What do you do with the subsequent meat products? You run that part of the chain harder too. It's just a higher volume going through the system, right?
I think it's amazing they were able to do that.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Notice my last comment,
Right.
adaptation and so forth. So the U.S. consumer benefited, I'll try not to get too far off, but in the general econ discussions, there's a lot of talk about the economic recovery. Was it going to be a V-shape, fall hard and come back fast? Was it going to be like the Nike swoosh, fall and take forever to come back? And lots of letters were being thrown around by economists, if you remember, a few months back. In reality, the processing of cattle and hogs, in hindsight, was a V-shape. It fell hard, and we hit about 40% lower than 2019 by the time we got to the end of April, but it came back pretty quick, pretty fast. Globally, consumers benefited strongly from that quick recovery because we got meat products coming to them quicker than yours truly thought we would. So that shouldn't be lost on folks.
As long as we can keep our local packers going.
Most packers are pretty busy these days.
That's right.
For a while. Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And did I hear correctly? It's kind of in and out on the audio. We were going to have access to these slides for the complete program.
Yes, you'll have them either on Ag Manager, but we'll, as committee members, she'll email them out either later tonight or first thing in the morning. Yes.
And if that was the only comment I'll add to it, is the Ag Manager website that I referenced, you will find a lot of similar talks, maybe not the specific one where I'm sitting in this room, but a lot of similar topics over time. Some of the charts I shared and so forth obviously evolve over time. So I would, not just because I created them, but because the industry and the market realities are evolving, please make use of them. That's why that website exists. They're out there. Every one of these public talks I give, you'll find them in PDF format, if not the day of, the day after the talk.
Representative Jacobs, do you have a question?
Well, that was my question, my
Oh.
thought, so I could.
Okay. Representative
do some
Minix?
research myself.
Okay. Representative Minix?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could follow up on Joe's earlier deal. Tyson had the fire. They came back just a week before Christmas or so. Early January, we're selling, and mid-January, we're selling fat cattle at 125, 128. The COVID pandemic hits, and about the middle of March, we start dropping. It drops to $95. That's 1/4 at least of the value of that same animal. The price of grain started to come up. When they got things kind of put back together, they could get enough workers. And I think they hired a lot of people that hadn't prior experience. They were hiring anybody they could because they were making $500 to $800 per head that they could process. And that's one reason that slaughter capacity came back so quickly. They were in a capitalistic environment. They were seeing huge returns at the packing plant, so they were killing everything they can. It seems like there for a while we were 10 or 15% higher kill rates per week than we had been on a normal situation. Am I close?
Yeah, on balance, I concur. So if I gave a full outlook talk, I would have walked us through, quarter by quarter what was occurring. And in that intermediate period between the Holcomb fire in August of 19 and the pandemic, even most narrowly, the first quarter of 2020, which is largely non-pandemic effect, we had higher both cattle and hog processing and volumes. We were pulling cattle forward. We were pulling hogs forward. That was an export pull. I mean, there was a market opportunity there. The issue we had would have been worse had the industry not been running hard at the time. You highlight the labor challenges and new entrants was part of that. I'm sure if we had folks from the industry sitting here, they would tell you there's a long list of adaptations that made that happen. But you're spot on that the markets were at work encouraging that to occur.
Representative Orr?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'll thank Mr. Minix for reminding me of the nightmare. Just a year ago today, I guess basically the anniversary of this COVID deal, I remember distinctly that you couldn't buy a freezer and you could not get an animal slaughtered at our local small packing plants. And we've seen a tremendous revitalization of the small plants. What's that going to do in the future? Is that going to have any significance?
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to that. This is just Tonser's opinion. That's what you're getting, right? So I'll give you that disclaimer. Early on, and my household was the same way, we didn't know what was coming at us. A lot of folks wanted to just be prepared at home. I wouldn't say we were hoarding things, but we loaded up in different ways than we did before. Some folks tried to get hold of a freezer and fill it with meat and so forth, right? I don't think that repeat behavior is very likely going forward. So that drive that was part of it, feels like a one-off in many ways. So the consumer demand pull part of that may not be as strong in the future is what I'm trying to impress on you. At the same time, some have learned to buy meat, and more generally, to be complete here, food from different sources. And some will stay with that, but it's to be determined how many stay with that if the price of that is higher than elsewhere. I don't think everybody will. So I think there's some opportunities in the future that weren't here 15, 18 months ago, but I don't know that it's the silver bullet saves everybody, pretend the next 3 years are going to look exactly like the last 12 months for that new effort. So I have a lot of caution of the next 3 years looking like the last year. That's probably what you were fishing for.
That's right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, other questions? Dr. Tonzer? I guess and some of Representative Orr brought that up, and you talked a little bit about kind of the future of kind of that farm grown or what that's going to be. Maybe look at, again, I go back to, I see those numbers where we are with boxed beef and still the disparity. I mean, that's going up in a trajectory where cash prices are going down. And as you can see, I'm a failed ag economist student from K-State, that's why I switched to communication. But, because I can tell the story, I can't but I guess looking at all the proteins, because we know the hog cutout also is high. I guess I don't want to go in the weeds too much, but the meat that's in the freezer, in the big freezers and going to consumers is relatively high, but I still see the cash price being relatively low. Where's this big demand going to be that's going to possibly bring down these boxers, these cutouts, this meat that's in the freezers, ready to either be exported or again, I guess focus on domestically. It looks like we're just going to keep going that way, other than our typical 7-year cycle in the cattle market, especially.
So there's a lot of things to unpack in
know,
that comment, so I'll choose the ones direct to, I guess. So there's a lot of optimism on the demand front for two sources. One is there's optimism that food service, foot traffic in restaurants, and therefore food service demand is going to come back. It's optimism to be determined exactly how much. I tell everybody Texas is open for business today. More states are going to make announcements like that, and I think with that, restaurant demand will probably come back, certainly compared to the same period a year earlier in 2020. Export demand, a lot of people are optimistic. There's a reason I showed you the 2020 pie chart and historically who are our customers. Several of those historic customers still want to be customers today. So there's that part that's optimistic. That's 2 of the 3 major market channels. The one I didn't mention is retail. So most of us, geeks that study this, would say we expect retail to be a little weaker in 2021 simply because of how strong 2020 was. But if you net out a little weaker, probably more positive, and I'd say exports a lot more positive if we don't have logistical challenges like ships off the coast that can't go anywhere. So we can talk through that if you want. That is part of the optimism in the industry that is supporting those prices. At the same time, we're likely going to have less cattle, as I showed you, and so forth. So your price relationships are impacted by a lot of things. The cutout value today is the supply and demand value of that today. The relationship between cutout and cattle prices over the next days, weeks, months is impacted by a lot of things, including how many fewer cattle we have.
Talk about branded programs. Where are they coming out of this COVID? What are their future? What impact, whether it be breed programs or some sort of a labeled program? Where's the future there?
So there's been a lot of growth over that's not just a COVID story, a multi-year story is branded beef and pork has grown a lot over time. I'll not use specific brand names to avoid endorsements and so forth, but there's a lot of opportunities for individual producers to be part of those. I think the segment of the population that either wants to know more or likes a specific claim behind those production, oriented practices and brands probably has some staying power. But we got to be careful not to overstate that, because if you make everything branded, there's no longer a differentiation, right? So these discussions quickly go, if everything became brand A, because brand A is a big success, well, it's no longer a success because it's the only thing out there, right? So at some point, it won't make sense for somebody to keep adding volume to brand A, and I'm doing that on purpose because I don't want to advertise for a particular brand. There's a role in the world for commodity non-branded. There's a role for lower end branded, and there's a role for more expensive branded. Those are different customer profiles, different events. Some of us are a lot less price sensitive back in the days when you travel and you're at a white tablecloth doing business because it's a business event versus if you're feeding your family. right? It could be the exact same household, but 2 different locations. Your price sensitivity is different because you're doing 2 different things. So therefore, what is the role of a premium brand versus a mid-level, more affordable brand versus commodity? There's a role for all 3. And our industry does a good job producing all 3, by the way.
Right. I guess a little bit of the trade, and we'll stay fairly close. Let's stay in North America. We keep hearing reports that there are a lot of cracks in the new NAFTA, the U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement. And, obviously, I mean, you look at the chart, Canada, Mexico, U.S. cattle are kind of all over and in between and so on. What's the possibility? We saw a past administration that, wanted to do a lot of different things that seemingly skewed extremely pro-U.S., not necessarily maybe an equal field. I don't know. The Biden administration has their ideas on doing different things, the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the long list of letters that's now evolved into as well. So I guess I don't necessarily want to go back and relive the whole thing, but primarily the relationship with Canada and Mexico, if we have, it looks like the Mexican dispute is what the dairy primarily, well, dairy I guess in Canada and other there's some other problems in Mexico, and so that could cause some real problems.
So again, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yes, yeah, sorry.
To be clear, the charts I showed earlier were volume of beef, either imports or exports. It was not cattle, it was not hogs, it wasn't live animals, it was beef. Right. They are slightly different numbers, and I didn't bring the charts for you on live animals, but live animal trade is almost exclusively North American. So feeder cattle and fed cattle, Mexico and Canada, for all intents and purposes, the only countries we have live animal trade with. Little sidebar, a little bit of breeding animals with other countries, but that's a very, very small percentage. Beef is a broader portfolio of countries, so that's an important clarification here. I'm not going to predict what the current administration will try to do, what trade deals are going to try to redo, enter, or whatever. I think that's a little out of my wheelhouse. I will say that exports have grown in importance for the beef industry. I showed my 2003 to 2019, the volume up by 20% was one of the numbers I shared with you. That understates the economic value and importance because that's volume, not value. We tend to export a more valuable item than we import. The simple example I always use is tongues. The average resident in Japan will pay a lot more for a beef tongue than I will because I'll pay 0. So anything above 0 is positive. But that's a simple value-added example, right? Those products going somewhere else adds value. Why am I interjecting that here? I'm not going to try to predict trade or company-specific stuff, but an open eye to the world wanting meat products from the U.S. and sustaining a good trade relationship, make no mistake, is really important for everybody in the meat and livestock industry.
Right. Well, and again, yeah, right. We're talking basically red meat protein rather than live animals. So I wouldn't, want to confuse anybody there. Other questions? Representative Haswood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since you're a professor at one of our universities, what gets the younger people excited about agricultural economics, and what are their bright ideas?
Oh, boy. I don't, you see the bald spot on my head? I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that. We have a lot of bright, young, early career professionals with a lot of energy, and that's great. What gets them excited? This is going to sound like a sales pitch for our department, but you kind of teed it up that way, so I'll answer that way, is job success rate, right, high placement, where your career can take you with a degree from, in our case, Department of Agriculture Economics at K-State, gets folks excited. The high likelihood you can get a job when you are done gets parents excited. Yeah, that's my best answer for you at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions? Representative Newland.
I would be very remiss if I didn't ask you when I need to sell my 600 or 800 pound calves this fall.
So again, if I'm giving full outlook talks, I talk through all the pros and cons all the time. The market is optimistic that cattle prices are going to improve as we go through 2021. That's a general statement. The reason is we have a lot of heavy cattle going through the system right now. And if you use the futures market as an indicator, future months we're expecting better prices. If you agree with that and you're comfortable with all the market risk around that, you should wait. Notice how many times I use the term if.
You have to pay for that either, so.
That's right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your input
Any
there.
other, any other questions? I do have, I guess, one more, and just as we go through this whole thing, and why I want to kind of bring you in to give people the opportunity. Let's talk just a little bit about imports. That's been a discussion here, and it's, you know, it's a discussion in some of the hallways. I'll try not to ask a question that you have a lot of unpacking. It can be hopefully put in a duffel bag. What do we import? What does, I believe most of it goes into ground beef. I understand that. I believe. What would happen if we decided that our beef, we're keeping it here? We're not going to export. We're not going to, or we're going to put a premium on it because it's U.S. beef on the open market. Here it is. What kind of an impact, good or bad, could that have on the industry, the economy, and so on?
So you blended both exports and imports in your comment?
Yes.
Did you do that on purpose?
Yes, I
Okay.
did.
And I'm not trying to pick on you, trying to be clear. So that study has not been done that I'm aware of, so I have to sit here and think out loud with you. That's all I can give you.
If you want to separate it, then that's fine, but I
Okay.
think, to me, in the broader scope,
Yep.
when the discussion is held in the coffee shop, in the pickup, on the cell phone,
Yep.
it gets blended together is why I ask it.
So, Mr. Chair, the best I can do is answer what I would expect to happen. As long as I tell you that's what I'm doing, that's okay. So that's what you're going to get. So if tomorrow we wrote a rule saying thou shalt not export beef, just pretend that's what you're doing, tongues and other things that we export almost all of, then would stay here. And they would enter either the human market or rendering or dog food or whatever the highest value of those items became here. On balance, I expect that to be a much lower price point than what they're currently bringing. Stated otherwise, they're going to another market for a reason. We don't send stuff to the third most valuable market. We send it to the most valuable market. That's how markets work, right? So if you close access to something, it goes to its next best. And if you close out all countries, you get rid of a lot of second, third, fourth, 24th best. You're stuck just at home on some of those things. So we'd have a lot of products that are worth not much. And at the extreme, some might actually become a waste item where it costs us to get rid of them. I mean, there would be some products that actually fall in that bucket. If you add all that up, the net value of the products that come from a carcass goes down. You're going to depress cattle prices. Now, notice I didn't use a single number because it depends on the magnitude and how long you do it and all those kind of things would drive. But directionally, that would not be good. We export volume-wise over 11% of what we produce. That understates the contributed value. You know, USMEF puts out a number, I believe it's over $300 per head, fed steers, the number floating around. One on-the-fly number is you take that $300 away, divide by 1,400 pound, you start getting a, you know, per hundredweight damage. I suspect that understates it because you're also going to kill relationships in lots of ways if you start not doing business with others, okay? So that's the export part. What about import stuff? If we said thou shalt not import tomorrow, do the exact same thing, on balance, what we import is for a blended effort in our ground beef system. Most of what we import is highly lean that we blend with less lean items that we domestically produce. We blend them to hit a given lean target. So for example, if you want an 85% lean, 15% fat hamburger product, that can come from two different sources that are blended to that. If we remove our source of highly lean, you'll further depress the value of the less lean that we domestically produce. I would argue that's why we do that, is economics at work. We can hit that 85% target cheaper and more efficiently by blending, because we're a ground beef nation is the phrase. We consume a lot of ground beef. We don't produce enough just for ground beef on items where they're most valuable for ground beef. We would start grinding things we don't grind today that have a higher value elsewhere to meet that. So whether you grind and take the value down or you have 50% trimmings that are worth less, it's the same story. Both sum up to less value of the carcass, downward pressure on cattle prices. I am anti putting borders up, don't export, don't import, to be clear.
Right, just wanted to kind of throw that out from a standpoint. And if I remember right, about a year ago, 10 months ago, weren't there weeks that we ground steaks because the demand for hamburger was higher than steaks and roasts. Is that correct? Do I remember that right?
It's largely anecdotal, but yes, I heard the same thing. My response to one of the earlier questions about loin and round values kind of being out of whack for a few weeks is consistent with that, right? Loin became worth a lot less because restaurant demand fell through the floor, literally, and therefore it made sense to grind. But we don't expect that to be a multi-week, much less a long-term relationship.
All right, last chance for questions. Saying none, again, Dr. Tonja, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. And I believe you have, committee, you have the presentation in your email. So Terry sent that out. And again, go to agmanager.info. There's a lot of stuff on a lot of different things you can learn. So a couple of things right quick. Reminder, if you're scheduled, which most everybody I think is scheduled. If you're not, that we're going to miss you tonight. We have a dinner at the TCC at 6 o'clock with the Farm Bureau. And also, you have minutes from February 24th, March 10th, 16th, and 17th. If you have any comments, review them and comment by tomorrow afternoon. Otherwise, they'll be posted on Friday. And the minutes from Monday, Tuesday, and today will be released Friday morning. And if you do have any comments, you have till next Tuesday. If not, they'll be posted as approved on Wednesday, March 31st. So with that, that will wrap up the Ag Committee. Unless for some reason we are mysteriously, which we won't because we probably won't be here. But we appreciate what has been a very interesting year. We've all kind of learned a lot as not only a new committee, but trying to get through all the COVID situation. So we thank you for your participation, whether you've been in person or online. And we are sure shooting for January of next year to be kind of traditionally normal, and we'll be back in close proximity, and we'll be doing quite a few things. And so if you do have ideas of things that you want to try to pursue, and some of those we didn't get to, we'll look at having hearings on and working next year. So with that, we want to thank my assistant Terry, who has done a great job. She is now she knows how to spell agriculture. No, I'm just kidding. But Terry has done a good job. We also thank John. Hopefully, John, you've been able to listen a little bit as well and gain some insights. We definitely should not take IT for granted. They have done a great source. So, anything else for the good of the cause? Seeing none and hearing none, Ag Committee is adjourned. Thank you.